Teachers have been banned from promoting the Black Lives Matter movement to children. Guidance from the Department for Education that was published on Thursday says what it calls contentious and disputed historic periods must be taught in a balanced manner. It comes after teachers were accused of introducing politically biased materials to pupils during lessons about issues such as the police, racism and colonialism. To discuss this today, I am joined by Francis Gilbert, who is a teacher and author. Francis Gilbert, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Now, Francis, I wanted to ask you about this. Now, a lot of this came about because there was the revelation about Brighton Council, and Brighton Council had introduced an anti-racist schools strategy, and what they had effectively done is kind of found a way to bring critical race theory into schools, which even its originators wouldn't disagree is a political thing. Do you think this is a problem that is happening across schools, or do you think it's not a problem at all?
I wouldn't say it was a problem. I would say that obviously teachers, and I was a teacher for 25 years, and now I educate teachers at Goldsmiths, on the whole, are really neutral and try and present things in a kind of balanced way.
Yes.
I suppose I worry about this guidance because it has sort of resonance for me of in the 1980s when, you know, as a teacher we were told about Stop Clause 28 and banned from supposedly promoting homosexuality, and it has a sort of echoes of that. So it feels like the government sort of telling us things that we're essentially not doing. We're wagging the finger at us.
Well, let's explore that a little bit. So when it comes to Section 28, and it was very specific about this, saying that the promotion of homosexuality, and the phrase they used was a pretended family relationship, and they said that this couldn't be talked about in schools. And the current situation with critical race theory is slightly different, however, because the fear about this is that you have an ideology that is being promoted in schools as though it is uncontested fact. Not that they're saying, look, let's have a talk about what critical race theory is, why is it coming over from America, why are so many people attempting to implement it in schools. It's not that is the fear. The fear from the Department for Education is that teachers are almost acting like activists and saying, no, this is something that is true, that society is undergirded by these power structures that we tell you about, that white privilege is a thing, that all white people are essentially oppressors or complicit in an oppressive system, whether they like it or not. So do you think there must be a distinction there between talking about something and simply asserting it as though it is truth? Do you accept that distinction?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's obviously arisen because of the murder of George Floyd, which created a kind of huge speculation over all these issues. And I know I taught for some years at a school called Sir John Cass Secondary School, and that school has now been renamed because we found out around about the time of the murder of George Floyd, and I taught there for many years and didn't know this, that he was a very prominent member in the Royal Africa Company in the late 17th, 18th century, and was involved in setting up the slave trade. And so that school was changed. That name was changed to All Saints, Stepney School, as it is now, because clearly the school and the parents, the governors, everyone came together of all political persuasions, because I know the Sir John Cass Company is, left and right are involved in that company, because clearly you can't have a school in the current context named after a slave trader,
But can you not? I mean, what would be more valuable in that situation? Is it to erase the name, pretend he was never associated with the school, or to talk about why the school is named that way, to engage with the reality, and often an unpleasant reality? Isn't that the more sort of educationally interesting approach?
Well, it's problematic, isn't it? Because he was very heavily involved with the setting up and the structure of the slave trade, and clearly, the money for that school sort of initially came from the profits of the slave trade. And I think the school felt that they're not going to ignore the history, and there was a big conversation about this at the time, and they will teach about how the school was previously funded and named after this man. So I don't think the history is ignored, rather I think it's actually discussed in more openness, because I didn't know anything about that when I was teaching there in the 1990s. No, it was never mentioned. He was celebrated as a sort of great figure that funded the school, whereas obviously he was a problematic figure, wasn't he? Because he did fund the school, but he made his money out of a terrible...
That's an interesting point, isn't it? That in a sense, where there have been failures of education, it's exactly as you described. Why weren't you told about this person? Why weren't you told about the history? And it seems to me that that does seem like a bit of a failure. But on the other hand, I feel that there are educational opportunities within acknowledge. I mean, just to sort of test this hypothesis a bit, how far would you go with this? So we all agree, everyone agrees that the slave trade was an evil. And no, you're not going to find someone who's supportive of slavery in this country. But then you have a number of schools have changed the house names of, say, J.K. Rowling House. And they've changed that name because they say that she is too toxic now. Well, that's not a settled matter, is it? You know, the matter of slavery was settled in the 19th century. J.K. Rowling, she's not a toxic figure for most people. Do you accept that there's a level of subjectivity to this that might cause problems with other sort of figures? Yeah,
I mean, and it is about, you know, like in the case of Cass at that time, now called All Saints Ethnic School, it was a big conversation with the governors and the parents and the then student body over it. So I think things like this have to be thought through really carefully, don't they?
So there has to be a conversation.
There has to be a democratic conversation, but ultimately, I guess, you know, that foundation renamed themselves because it was a big foundation. The Cass Foundation was a big foundation, and they've had a number of schools and an art school and another primary school, all of which have been renamed, and they've taken down the statue of Sir John Cass in London now. How do you feel on principle about that, though? I mean, and what if it were a more sort of a more contentious figure? If you take someone like Winston Churchill, right? So Winston Churchill is considered by many to be one of the greatest Britons of all time. Sort of defeated fascism. You'd give him a bit of a pass for that, maybe. But he was also certainly his cabinet was implicated in the Bengal famine, and people and some of the comments that he made about other races would say that he is a difficult figure. Similarly with Mahatma Gandhi, who made some comments about African figures, but at the same time got the British out of India, right? So there are pros and cons, right? Where would you stand on issues like that, where it's very difficult and very contentious? Would you feel comfortable with just destroying statues, taking away the names? Absolutely not. I mean, you know, it has to be a nuanced conversation, doesn't it? And, you know, those figures are obviously very different from someone whose main wealth came from the slave trade. And so, you know, I think that, and I would say, like, teachers, I would like to reassure the viewers here that teachers are very neutral, politically neutral figures, and they make every effort to encourage the students to have different points of view. And that's one thing I do certainly agree with in the guidance that's coming out from the government, that you need a balanced view, don't we? But I worry that if you know, does this mean that we're not allowed to talk about the murder of George Floyd, because that essentially did lead to a huge sort of growth in the Black Lives Matter movement, didn't it? That's not what they're saying. They're not saying you can't talk about George Floyd. They're not even saying you can't talk about Black Lives Matter. But I worry that the teachers might be worried that you can't bring it up because, you know, it does feel a bit like Clause 28 again, doesn't it? That you literally felt, I was teaching in the late 1980s there, you literally felt you couldn't mention homosexuality in schools without fear of effectively being arrested or sacked. Yeah, but the legislation with Section 28 was specifically anti-gay, insofar as it said things like you could mention it as long as it was linked with the spread of AIDS. So I mean, that's quite clear in where it's coming from. Whereas I think this sort of legislation, which is particularly targeted at things like critical race theory, is sort of saying, look, talk about it, but don't talk about it as though it's... Because this is an ideological perspective. You know, I mean, would you accept that? It's not something that is settled. It's not something that we believe that all white kids are... I mean, I would say that the Black Lives Matter movement, from my knowledge of it, is quite wide, isn't it? It's a massive, you know, political figures on the left and right have been supportive of it. So it's a huge thing that initially comes from the United States. It's not anything really initially. But that's the point. It doesn't really map very well onto our circumstances. Now, for instance, one of the Black Lives Matter, one of the principles on the website initially, which they've since taken down, is that we should dismantle the cisgendered nuclear family. Would you be comfortable with the teacher saying to the kids, this is what we need to do? You know? Absolutely not. Right, so I think that's what the legislation is attempting to address, is that kind of... obviously that's very doctrinaire sort of... is inappropriate, and I have never, ever in my experience, ever come across a teacher talk like that to any class. You know, they wouldn't. Well, you say that, but what do you make of the National Education Union? It's the biggest teachers' union, saying that there is an urgent need to decolonise every level of the school system, even down to the arrangement of the desks. And they talk about how what we need is more activists in the classroom. Now, that's coming from the biggest teaching union.
So you don't agree with them?
Yeah, that sounds, really ridiculous, doesn't it? I mean, an impossible job. Although I would say, we are supportive at Goldsmiths. We have had a movement for decolonising the curriculum and thinking about, the areas of history that have not been covered previously. So we do look at, issues around British colonialism which haven't been discussed. And that is a significant conversation, because many of the children that I've taught in London come from are of colour and come from those backgrounds and often don't even know what colonialism is.
I think that's a very interesting point, and I think that what you're identifying there is, I think it might be about different definitions. Some people feel that decolonising the curricula is all about exactly what you described, just simply maybe bringing in voices that haven't been heard before, expanding reading lists, that kind of thing. For other people, decolonising the curriculum is stripping it of dead white males, and I think the problem is that when people aren't clear about that, you get these conflicts,
Yeah, that certainly isn't the case, So we at Goldsmiths have a really big thing around the teaching of Shakespeare, and you think of a play like The Tempest, which is a sort of parable about colonialism, and it's a great play, isn't it? And so we teach that and teach, some been amazing recent productions of it that have looked at the way in which Prospero, the lead character in that play, is sort of a coloniser of that island, and he imprisons Caliban and Ariel, and we look at that and we can teach that interpretation to children, but also teach other interpretations, that he's a great magician and a great figure in many ways. So those sort of debates can be had in a class.
Although didn't Caliban and his mother imprison Ariel before Prospero got there? Let's not get into that. Anyway, the point is, I think it is an interesting thing to discuss. And just quickly before you go, because I'm fascinated by all of this, but I just want to know your thought, because I was a teacher myself, right?
Yeah.
And I knew a lot of teachers. Yeah. And to be honest, there was a temptation sometimes sort of push your political views I never did it, by the way, because I always did that thing of trying to challenge them, and I sometimes said things I didn't think to try and get that. But I did know teachers who were very much pushing either a left wing or a right wing. Do you accept that there's a temptation, that you've got a captive audience, malleable minds? You could proselytise, right?
Obviously, there's a temptation to give your views, but that isn't my experience of seeing teachers or myself. You try and give a different set of opinions and a balanced view to children, because that's what education is.
Couldn't agree more. I think we're talking about good teachers there. There are a few bad ones. Anyway, I won't go into that because I'll just be settling scores. Francis, thanks very much for joining me today. Thank you.